Good evening. My name is Mark Madison, and along with Randy Robinson and the Friends of NCTC, we help organize the Public Lecture Series. I want to welcome you to the National Conservation Training Center. I'm very excited about tonight's speaker here at NCTC. We are only very recent stewards of this landscape where we've had indigenous peoples hunting, fishing, and living and stewarding this landscape for thousands of years. And tonight we're going to have somebody speak about the first people of the Shenandoah and Potomac Watersheds. We're very fortunate to have Professor Carole Nash, who's at the wonderfully named James Madison University. And let me tell you about Dr. Nash. She's a professor in the School of Integrated Sciences at James Madison, where she's taught for 37 years. Her research focuses on the Piedmont, Blue Ridge, and Shenandoah Valley, specializing in Native American archaeology and environmental history. She's the author of many technical reports, scholarly papers, and publications, including co-author of Middle Atlantic Prehistory, Foundations and Practice. She's also president of the nonprofit Mountain Valley Archaeology, which partners with communities on archaeological and historical research in upland Virginia. She co-directs the Virginia Archaeological Certification Program, a citizen science initiative that partners professional and avocational archaeologists. She's a brilliant expert on the subject of Native Americans in this part of the country. So please give a very warm West Virginia welcome to Dr. Carole Nash.
Good evening. Happy Fat Bear Week. I hope you're playing. And I appreciate you all being here. The Great Valley Road, which hasn't been so great today. I know that there's a lot of struggle out there to just make it to places. So thank you so much for being here. I love coming to this part of the Shenandoah Potomac watershed, as we say in one word, simply because there is so much here and so many stories to tell. And I'm grateful for the time to share this with you this evening. So I begin by telling you that I myself am not indigenous, but in Virginia, these are the people who speak for indigenous communities. These are the tribal chiefs of Virginia. And we're going to talk a little bit about them toward the end. We'll talk just in brief about West Virginia and Maryland, but these are the people who we all need to know. And who welcome inquiry, who want to be part of these discussions. And so my life, my career, my students' lives have been enriched by having the opportunity to work with these folks. But if you take a look at Maryland, for example, there are no federally recognized tribes in Maryland. There are 7 in Virginia. We'll talk about that toward the end of this evening. But in 2012, the state of Maryland recognized the Piscataway Conoy tribe as well as the Piscataway Indian Nation, and in 2017, the Akahanak Nation over on the eastern shore. And so there are other Native communities in Maryland that have, as we say here, retained their connection to ancestral lands. And what I hope you're hearing already is that this is a very dynamic story. It's a very dynamic landscape. There are lots of changes that are coming, and the future, as we say, is looking very bright, although we certainly have had a few clouds along the way, and we'll get into that as well. In West Virginia, there are no federally or state recognized tribes. But there have been a number of bills introduced into the West Virginia legislature, so something to keep your eye on is we're trying to figure out exactly why it has taken this long, because there are definitely indigenous communities here, and that question is one that needs to be answered and will only enrich our communities by knowing those answers and meeting these folks. So I begin tonight by saying something that usually disappoints people, but that is to tell you that Shenandoah does not mean daughter of the stars. I'm very sorry to tell you that this was a ploy by the Virginia Tourism Corporation when automobiles were first introduced and roads were being built, money was being put into roads, and they were looking for prosaic names for regions in Virginia. And they decided that Shenandoah would be daughter of the stars. We've been doing a lot of research on the meaning of that word, where it may have originated, and it looks like we may be getting closer. It looks like it may be coming from the Cayuga around Lake Ontario, and that in itself is a story that could take a while to imagine, but it means big, broad land. And I think that is a pretty good description of the place where we live today. I do want to introduce a couple of terms and just tell you that when you are working with indigenous communities, what they prefer, of course, is that you know their names, that you are able to refer to them in the way that they want to be referred. But in popular culture, of course, you will see Native American, you will see Indian or First People, you will see indigenous, and ultimately, it does go back to the tribes themselves. So, for example, in Virginia and Maryland, you will see the whole range of names. And what I will tell you is there is a great deal of forgiveness, and the most important thing is to ask. And tonight you will hear me talk about Native Americans, you will hear me use indigenous, obviously you'll hear me use First People, so it's all mixed up there together. But that is a question that I am often asked. I think it's also important this evening, as we're getting started, to recognize that the story that I'm telling you does not exist in a vacuum. This is a story that extends well beyond our region, and if you take a good look at this map, you will see this great valley that extends all the way from Canada down into Alabama, and each of these numbers represents a locally named valley. And you have to keep that in mind, because that Great Valley Road, as we refer to it, was a migration pathway and a pathway of interaction for thousands of years. And so when you think about this part of that valley system, you need to recognize, of course, that valleys do what they do best, and that is they funnel things. And so the connections that exist between native populations in New York State and those in going down toward Tennessee and so forth, they're very real, and they play out in this area in really amazing ways. And we'll talk about that tonight as well. I also encourage us, because I know that many of us who spend time out in this neck of the woods spend time in public lands. And a lot of times, if you're not just in the Forest Service, but if you're, say, for example, in a national park, access is pretty restricted. There are certain ways you can get in and certain ways you can't get in, or you're not supposed to get in. And so for us, in our culture today, mountains have been something to visit, something that is apart from us, something that may even be restricted. And yet, when you look back through history, that is a very recent phenomenon, even well into the historic period. The connections between East and West, not just North and South, but between East and West. I talk about this region as a place of connection and isolation. It's one of these places where you definitely see that long connection, but at the same time, through time, you begin to recognize that people have settled in very specific areas and are developing their own identities. So the geography is important. That's one of the things that makes the archaeology of this area so special. It's putting together the environmental history, the geography, along with the indigenous history. I also think it's important to recognize that we're not quite as isolated as we think. And of course, today we're wandering around on airplanes and we can get places very quickly. But thinking back several thousand years, there were still routes of connection. And I'm always amazed when I recognize this one statement: the Allegheny Front is a miniature continental divide. It truly is. And so to the east, you've got the Atlantic drainage. The Shenandoah and the Potomac are going out in that direction. But you head down south just a bit in West Virginia and in Virginia, and your waterway is going to the Gulf of Mexico. And that's all happening right here. We live in this compressed space where you find really interesting features coming together. And this fact plays in very strongly when it comes to our discussion of exchange and the way that Native people were connected to each other through trade routes. Very real. So something to put this in perspective. Of course, you see me coming from Virginia. My family has moved 6 miles in 300 years. I'm the first one to move west of the Blue Ridge. So my story often is focused on Virginia. But just to give you something to hang your hat on, 1607, that only takes you back to about 15 or 16 generations of people. Native people have been in this place for at least 500 generations. At least 500 generations of families, of people living in this area, knowing this area in ways that we can't even begin to approximate. And so that will come out, I believe, in the talk this evening. You'll also hear me talk about different cultural periods, and these are names that archaeologists give to lifeways and cultural traditions that are separated through time. And of course, scientific process, the scientific procedure is one of taxonomy, right? We like to put things in boxes. We like to make sense of things by seeing what's alike and what's different. And it's the same with archaeology. We just name these cultural periods as basically a mnemonic so that we can have it in our heads, the different time periods that we are talking about. So tonight, when you hear me refer to these, I will remind you of the actual time period so that it won't seem hopefully so alien, but at the same time, archaeologists do tell time in odd ways. As I often tell my students, it's one thing to say to somebody, yes, these people were here 1,500 years ago. It's another thing to really understand what that means. Completely different way of telling time and telling history. So had I given this talk to you last year, this would have started off differently, but we're doing it this year. And so one of the big questions in North American archaeology is, who were the first people? Where did they come from? And when did they get here? And this has generated so much discussion in the history of American archaeology. Some of you well know that we had this figured out. We thought the story was the Bering Land Bridge, the movement across the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into North America, case closed. Well, not so fast. We need to go back even further to tell the story of what we know right now. In the history of archaeology and working with environmental science, it was assumed that North America, and in particular the crossing from Siberia over, would have been too cold, it would have been too extreme, there would not have been a passage toward what we call the last glacial maximum, just too much. And so that time period, it was assumed that this continent was populated, but not before 20,000 years ago. Well, the fact of the matter is there have been found recent things that have started to change this. And the information about the footprints at White Sands National Park in New Mexico has been out for a while, and it has taken us, myself included, a little bit of time to accept it because we wanted to see multiple lines of evidence coming together, and indeed, it looks like it's coalescing. And so what we have is an environment that today, White Sands, you can imagine, we're talking about a desert kind of environment, was very well watered, and marshes and things of that sort, and footprints that have been preserved and dated from 21 to 23,000 years ago. So what that has done is it has reopened this discussion of where these folks were coming from and how they got here. Because the environmental history, the geologic history, is telling us that there was no open corridor. There was a land bridge, but there was no open corridor to get into North America on foot. So stay tuned. I think it's really exciting to be part of this discussion. What we have also seen is another change that has shaken the way that many of us learned North American archaeology from our textbooks when we first started, and that is that the first people who came indeed might not have come down an ice-free corridor, but rather in different ways. So Clovis is the first cultural identifiable spear point that we archaeologists sort of held on to as the indicator of first people, and we'll show you that in just a moment. What we're finding, though, are layers that are buried below Clovis at archaeological sites in many different places. So we now refer to them as pre-Clovis, and they appear to be directly connected to cultures in eastern Siberia. One is in Virginia, radiocarbon dated to 18,500, what I say YPB, meaning years before present. So I don't want to confuse you with radiocarbon years or ADBC, any of that stuff, just years before present. So you get a sense, 18,500 years ago, essentially. But this is one of the premier sites where very early people have been found. Sites have been found on the eastern shore, in the Carolinas, out in the Midwest, and the evidence is building that there were indeed people here right after the end of the last glacial maximum. And that means pretty cold. So we will talk more about that environmental history in just a second. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, which is not that far from here. You go up into Pennsylvania, head southwest from Pittsburgh, and you're at Meadowcroft. It is this beautiful rock shelter with stratified deposits and the same kinds of spear points, the same kinds of dates. So the reason I tell you this, I spend a little bit of time telling you this, is to be very honest and tell you that as a science, there are so many things archaeology does not know. And so many things that we are learning, and we have to turn our heads and put them on differently on a fairly regular basis, which is fun, but also confounding. So that's part of the deal as you go along. But what we do have, we don't have any of those early sites here in the Shenandoah or Potomac Basin that we know of yet, and we've been looking for them. We do have a culture period that is known as Paleo-Indian, named early Indian, named by archaeologists, and 13,000 to 11,500 years ago. So climate's starting to warm, but nowhere near what we have today. And so these are folks who are hunter-gatherers, and what we mean by that, and just thinking about what you heard earlier in my introduction, the fact that there are sites on this property that are thousands of years old, they were occupied by hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gatherers are small-scale societies. There's not hierarchical leadership. There is egalitarianism, but they are kin-based. They are kin-based. So think about a family reunion. Think about it that way. Maybe 5 or 6 families at the most in the very early days, becoming much larger later on. But lifeways that are based on what could be retrieved seasonally, more often than not, hunting, fishing, gathering wild plants, a whole knowledge base that we can only begin to approximate today. But also sharing a very, very important part of the worldview. This is something that is seen all over the world. Wherever hunter-gatherers have been studied, these are the characteristics that they all share. And then mobility, they move around a lot. And this is something that makes archaeology in this part of the world so incredibly interesting and so complicated, because these are not necessarily easy landforms to move around in, and heavily vegetated. It's not easy to see stuff. I have colleagues who work in the Southwest, and they're like, look at this house I found. And I'm like, I mean, you know, we have to deal with it. But the fact of the matter is, when you're trying to understand how people made a living and how they moved seasonally, you have to have an idea of where they might have gone. And so we do have models. We do have models that we use that help us predict where we might find archaeological sites. And so we rely on those very heavily. But there is also something that is coming out more as we are tuning in more to indigenous cultures and listening more to tribal stories, even among folks who are not hunter-gatherers now, that ancestry of hunting and gathering, which was theirs, and indeed was all of ours at one time or another. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for hunter-gatherers. You wouldn't be here if somebody in your past didn't know how to make stone tools. That is a human fact. But when we think about hunter-gatherers and indigenous societies, we are thinking about a way of looking at the world where all things are related. You know, you look at a tree as a sister or a brother, or you refer to a mountain as grandfather. There are strong relationships that exist in that way. As I often tell my students when we talk about indigenous languages, in no indigenous language in the world is there a separation or a binary between culture and nature. We have that. That's something that's very distinct in modern languages, and in the English language, it did not emerge until the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, nature as a term was used to refer to what is fundamental, the nature of things. It wasn't until after the Industrial Revolution that nature became that thing out there. So within our own history, this is a very recent way of thinking about that relationship. I think it's something to keep in mind. Okay, so back to the Clovis people, back to the first people that we know of in our own area. For many decades, they were, of course, recognized as the earliest. What you're seeing here is the Laurentide ice sheet, and you can see that it's pulling away, it's melting, so getting out of the Pleistocene, the Ice Age, into the Holocene, and all of these dots are pointing you to places where Clovis artifacts have been found. So very clearly, this continent filled in pretty quickly with people. There is no question about that. But you also have to realize that things look quite different. In terms of seasonality, probably a very short summer and a very long winter, no spring or fall to speak of. Okay, and a different ecosystem altogether. This would have been boreal forest. This would have been taiga, what you see today in Canada, and then cold grasslands. And I'm often asked about the critters that may have lived here in those grasslands. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But where we are right now would have been this mosaic of those cold grasslands and boreal forest. You get up into the highest elevations and you would probably be seeing tundra. So if we're thinking about the Blue Ridge, the mountain system so close to us today, the highest elevations would have been tundra. At Big Meadows in Shenandoah National Park, we have geologic evidence of isolated patches of glaciers. We have evidence of tundra environments up there. So there's really nothing like it today that would match that environment. But if you go to Dolly Sods, any of you who've ever been up to Dolly Sods or down to Mount Rogers in Grayson County, or anything over 4,000 feet, essentially, you would be over 3,400 feet, really, but really over 4,000 feet. You would be seeing something that would approximate what the valley floor would have looked like when the first people came here. Now, when I first started doing my work in the mountains, I was not expecting to see very many Clovis sites at all, because I had it in my head that would have been so inhospitable up there that nobody would have been in their right mind, would have been hanging out up there if they had the river valleys to go to. And one of my friends who does archaeology in the Rocky Mountains looked at me and said, "Are you out of your mind?" He's finding Clovis sites at 12,000 feet. So these are very adaptable folks. The site that is closest to us, that has given us perhaps the best glimpse of Paleo-Indian culture, is the Thunderbird site near Front Royal. I was really fortunate. I was the last person to run the work there before the museum closed. It used to be open to the public, and we had World War II ducks. We would go from the museum across the river to the site, which was pretty fun in itself. But 13,000 years ago on the South Fork of the Shenandoah, and this is what one of those Clovis points looks like. What you see in the middle, the skill that it takes to make something like that, the choice of raw material, so knowing your rock. These folks were geologists. They knew what to look for. When you have a way of life, as they did, that was primarily based in hunting, certainly supplemented by gathering, but think about what we just said. The taiga is not necessarily known for a whole lot of plant resources and not a lot of small mammals per se. And so when you think about the need for a toolkit that would allow you to take down an elk, for example, because white-tailed deer would not have been very common at all at this time, too cold. You imagine a point that had to be made very, very well out of very sharp stone, but also lots of other tools that were used specifically for processing those animals, like the scrapers that you see in the upper left-hand corner, or the blades that were used for cutting. So the Thunderbird site, the reason the Thunderbird site is where it is there is a wall of brown jasper. It is beautiful. It is across the river from the site, but there are quarries there, and Native people were getting that jasper for thousands of years, starting with the Paleo-Indians. So we are very fortunate to live in an area where we can actually see that. One of the most amazing things about the Thunderbird site is that when it was excavated, and only about 5% of it has been excavated, the rest of it is in conservation easement, and the Archaeological Conservancy owns it, so it is protected in perpetuity. But one of the things that was found in that excavation was what we call post stains, and they are the rotten stains, the rotted stains of as you can see here, the saplings that were used to frame a house. And when we put it back together again, so it's like reading a floor plan on a blueprint. When you map in these dark circles, when we put it back together, that's what the house looked like. And it is one of the only that has ever been documented in Eastern North America, one of the few in North America, period. And it's in all the textbooks. So right in your neighborhood. Thunderbird has not been open to the public since 1987. We are working with Samuel's Library in Front Royal about developing an exhibit so that people can know more about it again. It used to be wildly visited. Oh my gosh, the kids who would come through there. But there it is. Now, this is one thing that I will end with on the Clovis period, and this is a recent find on the Potomac River in Stafford County. So getting out of Washington, D.C. and going out toward the Chesapeake Bay, where the Potomac is very broad. The Potomac tribe was working with a group of archaeologists. The city of Stafford was building a new school, and they were required by law to do archaeology. And the Potomac tribe became involved because this area is very important to them. They were invited and actually helped design the research. And during the excavation, there was found this beautiful Clovis point that actually matched, the chemical fingerprint matched a quarry that had been found in Culpeper County. So that's pretty cool. But what you also may not know, you've heard the phrase getting blood from a stone. Stones actually hold blood. And so you can do DNA analysis on stone tools and find out what they were used on. And this is what that point was used on. It was used on bison antiquus, which of course is much bigger than bison. And there is evidence from Pennsylvania coming all the way down into Virginia that the grasslands in the Piedmont were indeed home to these animals. Yeah, so that's new. That has opened up a lot of ways of thinking for us as well. And you can imagine the need to have a very good point to deal with an animal that size. I mean, we're talking a hornspan that is 6 feet. This is a very big animal. Okay, so getting out of the Paleo-Indian period and moving forward into the Archaic period, again, the archaeology terminology, 11,500 to 3,500 years ago, this is 8,000 years of people getting settled in this place, populations growing, folks understanding the resource base, and then migrations and interactions. It really set the stage for the complexity that we see in later periods in the archaeological record. But this is when climate had really started to warm. We started to see the approximation. The record is showing us very clearly the approximation of the 4 seasons that we have today, really rapid warming, and people responding to that because the landscape began to fill in. When you try to figure out just how many Paleo-Indians there may have been in Virginia and the Panhandle of West Virginia at any given time, maybe 150 or 200. Okay? During the Archaic period, thousands of people. You really start to see the landscape fill, and there are sites everywhere. One of the cool things about doing the work that I do is that I will be somewhere. I was at Montpelier over in Orange County on Saturday. I was walking on a trail, minding my own business, look down, and what is that? What do I see? A stone tool. I'm like, yep, there it is. They're everywhere. If you know what to look for, they are everywhere. And I think it's important to recognize the fact that they were here. It's so important to see that. So as we get into this is the greatest use of the uplands, is during this Archaic period, interestingly enough. Later on, the focus was more on the rivers and in the floodplain, reason for that coming up. But we refer to this as the golden age of hunting and gathering, essentially the Walmart of places that you could certainly call it. But it is during this time period that you see, we have evidence of the transition to the hardwood forest that we see here today. We were really fortunate to work with USGS at Big Meadows in Shenandoah National Park. We took a core out of the fen, the wetland up there that went back, just a core of sediment, wet sediment that went back almost 70,000 years. We were able to radiocarbon date the different levels. And we are able to, if the sediment has enough protection, if you're not dealing with erosion or loss in that way, what you end up with is pollen that stays in the soil for that long. And pollen is very specific to the plant that it comes from. And when you can segregate out the pollen species and the different layers of the core, you can literally see the forest changing over time. And there were 31 forest changes up there in the last 70,000 years, and you don't see the hardwood forest that we think of as being here from time immemorial. You don't see it until about 5,000 years ago. So keep in mind that you, again, live in a very dynamic area because of these mountains. You all know how hard it is to predict the weather. It's impossible, right? So the 12 seasons of the year, August, the front porch of hell and all of that, that's the sort of thing that you often hear people talk about, and there's a reason for that. It is because of these mountains and the uplift, and you get microclimates and you get all kinds of patterns that are very difficult to predict. So I have a good friend who's a meteorologist, and he just throws his hands up and says, whatever. But fishing became a focus. So just as the climate was warming, the rivers were warming as well. Around 4,500 years ago, start to see the migration of the anadromous fish. You start to see the rivers filling in with shad down in the coastal plain, the tidal rivers, and you get up into the hinterlands and you're looking at eel migration and suckers and all sorts of other critters that are moving around. But it is during this time period that we find these wonderful fish weirs. And there is a citizen science project that's taking place right now, people just sitting down with Google Earth, zooming in and looking at the rivers to see if they can find evidence of these fish weirs. And what I mean by that is you can see how you've got the pattern right here, you've got one coming in like that. These are just rocks that have been piled on each other, and you can see they come to a point right here, and that's where this basket would have been placed, and you could just gather fish, like, as we say, like shooting fish in a barrel. They're just right there for you to gather. And these fish weirs are all up and down the Shenandoah and the Potomac. There are high concentrations of them, and on the floodplains next to them are very large archaeological sites that have evidence of huge fire hearths where these fish were being processed, probably smoked for preservation purposes. But if any of you have ever gone camping and have set a fire ring, you know when I say fire cracked rock, you know what I mean. Rock will spall, it turns red, the iron in it will oxidize, and we will just find this everywhere on those floodplains in the time period, that this particular time period. The fish hooks that are made from the cannon of a deer bone, and this of course is from John White, the famous watercolorist from eastern North Carolina, but very much like what we see here as well. And then a wonderful image of women, children, probably going down and getting mussel shells. We get lots of mussel shells at archaeological sites. A lot of them no longer with us. So we have actually worked with folks from Fish and Wildlife, not federal Fish and Wildlife, but in Virginia, who've been trying to track the distributions of these species of mussels that are no longer there. And you go to the archaeological record and you can find them. So that is a pretty cool thing to be able to introduce. Archaeology is very multidisciplinary. I hope you hear that in all the stories that I've told you today so far. But the mountains became part of the settlement round during the Archaic, and they continued to be used. And so this is when, for example, in the Blue Ridge, we find archaeological sites that date to the Archaic that are acres in size. You just get the idea of multiple families coming together and aggregating in place seasonally, probably for berries, for nuts, all kinds of things like that. We also have evidence at the end of the Archaic of burning, intentional burning, ignition. We've been able to see this all through the Blue Ridge. Very clearly, we've been able to get radiocarbon dates, and it corresponds with the emergence of the chestnut as the dominant tree. And the chestnut, of course, is fire tolerant, and if you burn around it, you end up with an open forest, but you also end up with really big, healthy chestnut trees. And they were clearly doing something to impact that harvest with fire. And I work with the fire team in Shenandoah, and we've been trying to figure out sources of ignition because, of course, how do you know it's not just a natural fire? How do you know it wasn't started by lightning? Well, we're sort of zeroing in on that, but fire was part of this landscape as well. And then continuing, what gets really challenging as you are learning archaeology is that the way that spear points were made during the Archaic began to change pretty dramatically. That Clovis point is found all over North America. Slight variation, but pretty much the same thing. You see a Clovis in Colorado, you see one in Virginia, and you know what it is. By the time we get to the Archaic period, populations growing, people are beginning to regionalize, and they're starting to make their spear points to represent themselves out of the rock that is available to them. Instead of just looking for the high-quality jasper or chert, they're willing to mess around with quartz. And I don't know what you all think of quartz, but quartz is no fun. Quartz is brittle, quartz is hard to break, and yet these folks excelled at making spear points out of it. Quartzite as well, metarrhyolite that comes from the Catoctin Mountains, greenstone that comes out of the Blue Ridge, sandstone used for grinding stones and for hammer stones coming from the west. As I was mentioning earlier, the geology. But when you have training like I do, you can look at a collection like this and start to put things in order. You can actually see where they fit and tell the story of the evolution of the site itself. Another thing that changed during the Archaic was a new technology for hunting, and this is the atlatl, the throwing spear. And it is a really interesting tool. There are lots of people who throw them today. It is illegal to throw spears in the city of Harrisonburg, so we don't practice in the backyard. But it is the case that these are deadly weapons. They are forceful, and they are very accurate. They're actually clubs that throw atlatls today. If any of you Google them, you will find a club probably not far from here if you want to learn how to throw an atlatl. But you can imagine that this is very different from trying to get close to an animal and throw a spear like this or thrust a spear like this. This is going to be much safer in terms of hunting technology, but also a technology that allowed more efficient hunting just overall. And of course, the species are changing. So with the oak hickory forest, you've got the white-tailed deer, you've got the brown bear, the black bear, the wild turkey, and all of those things. But as an archaeologist, I get excited about this stuff. When I mentioned that I was at Montpelier and I looked in the trail and I saw a flake, what I meant was it was a piece of rock that had been broken off of a core by a flint knapper who was making something. And these were picked up and used regularly. So you have to recognize that in many ways, if a rock was found that was going to do one job, it was going to do a lot of other jobs. So we pay a lot of attention to flakes. And to give you an example, so this is what flint knapping, some of you may have had the opportunity to watch somebody actually doing this. It's like watching paint dry. It's not a whole lot of fun, but you learn a lot. And as I tell my students all the time, and I mentioned earlier, somebody in your family knew how to do this. How did we forget? I'm awful at it. I am terrible at this, and I've been trying for 40 years. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of physics involved. You have to know how to hit a rock right in the right way. You have to know what rock to use to start with. You have to know how to work with it once you have knocked a flake off. It's very complex. And I find it really fascinating that this technology that essentially got us to where we are is one that we know so little about today. But anyway, you get the idea. So you can see the person here, the flint knapper, who has what we call a billet. This is an elk antler that has been smoothed over and used that to break flakes off, and then a pressure flake using the antler tine of a deer to sharpen a tool. So we look for these things primarily because they themselves are tools. So for example, you see a flake like this, you look out, you pick it up and look at it, and you realize that it was used for scraping. You realize that this was used as a knife, cutting edges. You realize that this was used to punch things. So you get every day. You start to get the everyday when you are paying attention to these things like flakes. It's really remarkable, the very stories that they tell. Spoke shaves, one of my favorite. This is a very simple tool. It's just a flake that has been knocked off, but it has a concavity, and you could run it up and down your arrow later on, or your spear shaft, to get rid of all of those hairs, all of those things that would slow it down, making it more aerodynamic. So So just things like that that really give you insight into what was happening at that site. What were these folks doing? Not just when were they there, but what were they doing? So we get very excited about that. It's also during the Archaic that we find these sorts of tools becoming much more frequent. We find the grinding stones, the mortars, we find net sinkers, nets that have been made and these tied onto the edges so that they will weight it down in the water, probably at the edges of fish weirs and so forth, axes and things of that sort that are sometimes mistakenly referred to as tomahawks. People think they were war weapons. These are woodworking tools, and we find those as well. Pretty cool. One of the neat things that really comes out during the Archaic is this. This is a steatite bowl or soapstone bowl. It is an artifact type that does not appear before the late Archaic. These are heavy. These things weigh about 25 pounds. They're made from soapstone or steatite, as we say, and they were carved. And if you look at this map, you'll see that steatite is found in a very restricted range in Virginia, and yet we find these bowls all through Virginia, well into West Virginia, almost out into the Ohio Valley. And the notion is that these were probably used in ritual settings. One of the things we've seen, for example, in the Shenandoah National Park at some of these huge aggregation sites that I was telling you about that are acres in size, we will find bowls like this, but they have been broken. They have been flipped over and someone broke them. And it's not unusual to excavate sites in other areas and find only pieces of them. And you can imagine that if this bowl is a ritual object and if cooking the meal in it was significant, that the people who were there as a memento, as a piece of something that reminds them of the event, would take it with them. And so we're starting to recognize this more and more, but those are pretty remarkable. But what also happens at this time is the emergence of an interest in not domesticating plants per se, but definitely focusing in on wild species and starting to make decisions about which ones they wanted to pay attention to. So everything that you see here, with the exception of sunflower and the Curcubito, pepo, the gourds, the rest of these today we think of as weeds, but they are incredibly nutritious plants. There is no question that Native people were choosing them, that they were incorporating them into their diet. This is when we see the mortars, we see the grinding stones, and you recognize a technology that is directly responding to food sources that are changing for them and the interest that they are having in the possibility of even raising some of these in gardens, in small gardens. So that takes us into the woodland period, the last period, and this is, as you can see, 3,000-year period, but this is the period of settled horticulturalists and agriculturalists who are living in the river valleys. And often when students, and particularly kids, will ask me about Native people, this is what they're thinking about. They're thinking about people who lived in villages and that sort of thing. So let's talk a little bit about this. One of the hallmarks of the woodland period is pottery. In the eastern United States, we don't see pottery much at all until you get to the woodland period. And it is at this time that groups are beginning to coalesce in specific river valleys, when we actually begin to see evidence that people who are directly ancestral to historically documented folks have settled in place. And the pottery itself, I call it the container revolution because pottery changed diet. Think about how what you have to cook with changes what you eat. Okay? This is the sort of thing to consider when you're looking at pottery. Pottery allowed folks to set food, what they were cooking, over a fire and leave it there to cook. Prior to that, no technology that we know of that they had allowed them to do that. They cooked in what we call skin bags and did stone boiling. So they would have a bag, maybe the bladder of an animal, that they would have mixed their stew in, made their stew in, and then to heat it, they would get rocks out of the fire and put it down in the bag. And we do find stone boiling. We do find evidence of that. But this changed everything in terms of diet, because what this allowed folks to do was to expand even further the foods that were available to them, because they could cook stuff that they previously could not have digested. And so if you think about what it's like to eat raw corn, not a whole lot of fun for your digestive system, but boy, cooked corn is pretty good. And I think that as you go through this and just think about it in your own lives, the way that technology changes the way that you do things or what you have access to, you get the idea of what I'm talking about here. It's during this time period as well that the bow and arrow was introduced. A lot of times you will hear folks refer to spear points as arrowheads. They're not really. The true arrowheads are these, the triangles, and they were introduced very late, before European contact, pretty close to. They were introduced, and there were generations of people who were using atlatls as well as bows and arrows together before finally the bow and arrow seems to have led to the obsolescence of the atlatl, and you see only bows and arrows. So one thing to keep in mind as far as that goes. We also introduced during this time period some permanent marks on the landscape that are landmarks that are very important to indigenous communities today, and these are burial mounds. There are two burial mound traditions in Western Virginia and the Panhandle. The first one is this, the stone burial mound tradition. The stone burial mounds, interestingly enough, are almost always found on bluffs overlooking floodplains where there are fish weirs. There is a strong relationship between the placement of these burial mounds and the villages and the fish weirs that are down below. The excavations that had been done long ago in the past showed us that these contained very few, only one or two people at the most. So the notion is these were probably seen as ancestors, and they were venerated. The villages were set up down below, and all of a sudden you begin to see this whole package emerging just in terms of cultural practice that had not been there before. One of the things you will probably notice in this photograph is that there is a hole here. It is incredibly sad to think about this, but I have never seen a burial mound that was not looted in one way or another. This happens a lot, and it happened a long time ago. You can read the local histories of this area from all the counties, and folks will talk about these mounds, and then they will invariably say, so-and-so dug this out of, And so these were not places that were understood or respected as we get into historic settlement. But today, they are recognized as very, very sacred places. So there is that tradition to talk about. But basically, these are pretty small. They're only about 20 feet in diameter, and they are covered with earth and stone, and there is a trench around them to separate them from the land that is right next to them. So that's something that a lot of people want us to look at. They think they have found them. A lot of times they're field clearing piles from the historic era, but every now and then somebody will come across one that we did not know about, and that's really pretty amazing to walk into a place and see one of those. But continuing with this, moving forward here in time pretty quickly, about 1,000 to 400 years ago, we actually have an archaeological culture that we name, that we know to be ancestral to the Eastern Siouan people. There is absolutely no question about that. And when I say Eastern Siouan, I'm talking about the language family. And today in Virginia, the tribe that represents that language family are the Monacan Nation. And we'll talk about the other tribes here in just a moment. But the Albemarle culture blankets the Piedmont, the Blue Ridge, the Valley, coming up into the Panhandle. This is a very big culture that is identified by individual villages that are placed about 10 miles apart, and you can start to see communities. The archaeological record really gives you a sense of their communities when you're telling that story. The food, the diet, as I mentioned, pottery of course makes all the difference, but these folks never gave up hunting and gathering, okay? And in fact, one of the things we're starting to understand about corn in the diet is that it came in very late, but also it was a minority element. And it looks like a lot of the diet was still based in wild foods. And we also see that these villages were moved about every 20 years. And what we take that to mean is that the resources in that immediate area had been exhausted, and it was time to move to another place. And you can, in some instances, as you get down into the upper valley, you get into the upper valley, of course, the river flowing north, and we get always confused instead of the Shenandoah flowing south. But anyway, you get to the headwaters of the Shenandoah, and in those areas, we've been able to literally follow villages as they have moved, and direct response to their use of resources. And so maize, as I mentioned, it took 5,300 years for it to make its way from Mexico into the eastern United States. It's not as though one day somebody came across maize and said, finally, there had to be a way to bring it in, there had to be a way to process it, and growing corn is no small task. You all know that. You know what it's like to have gardens, and not only chasing away the birds, but also getting it to germinate. There's enough water for it, the whole 9 yards. It's a huge investment, just like making pottery is a big investment. Doing this kind of thing is a tremendous investment, and all kinds of learning curves that had to be involved. But it finally makes its way here only about 700 years ago. So in Virginia, when I see the license plates that say First Farmers of Virginia, and it shows you the settlement at Jamestown, I'm like, that is not true. That is not true. All right. But that's what it looks like when we find it archaeologically. We find these little cobs. We don't find huge cobs. We find cobs that are about that big. And it's not at all unusual to find beans with them. Beans, it's kind of a package deal. So you've probably heard of the Three Sisters that actually from an ecological perspective makes a whole lot of sense for those three things to grow together. The beans are fixing nitrogen, the corn is fixing phosphorus, and then the gourds are providing shade, and the squash providing shade and holding the moisture. And so it's a really ingenious way to spend your time planting if you're going to do that. But we do also find, in response to the adoption of these new foods, storage technologies that we had not seen previously. So big pits that are being dug within the village sites themselves to store the food that is being preserved for the winter. In terms of protein, absolutely no question, white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer was number one on the menu. Wild turkey, number two. And number three, the good old box turtle, we think because you can get to turtles in the wintertime when you're not going to find any deer, you're not going to find any turkeys per se. And so it is interesting that you see this pattern over and over again. Protein, deer, very important in this diet, absolutely, no question about that. The other burial mound tradition that I mentioned is called the accretional burial mound tradition. It is more recent, closer to us in time, and these are much larger burial mounds, and these are in different locations. These are down on floodplains where small streams are meeting larger rivers. And we think of these as communal burial grounds. They're called accretional because they accrete or build up over time. And what we're talking about is a feature, this is where they have been documented. You'll notice none in coming over into West Virginia, but the Shenandoah River Basin, very much a big part of this. The Potomac River is really interesting because there is a different burial tradition there, the ossuary burial tradition, which is the in-ground pit. The burial mounds are more like this. And what we believe happened with these is that people who lived in villages that were approximately 9 miles, the buffer zone would have been about 9 miles from each other. Whenever someone passed away, they would be buried in place. But every 20 years, we don't know what the cycle was, 25 years, anyone who had died at that time during that period was removed and brought to this central location from all of those villages, and they were buried together. It's a very powerful statement of community. We may be looking at clan organization here. We may be talking about clans, but these were incredible features, probably, as you can see, about 15 feet high, 40 to 80 feet in diameter, and known to hold well over 1,000 people. And so you get the idea. These are very, very sacred places, and one of the first things that happened to them with European settlement is they were plowed over, because they were in the floodplain where the soils are that we need for the wheat that we are raising or the tobacco that we are raising. And you read this in all of the histories. Yes, there was a mound there, but we got rid of that pretty quickly. Today, we are working, we do believe this is an Eastern Siouan burial tradition. We're working with Monacan Indian Nation to identify the places where these mounds once were and to try to figure out what's left of them. And we've been fortunate to work with some property owners who recognize what is on their land and they're setting them aside. And we're very pleased that that is happening, and it's an ongoing process as well. But the really amazing thing about these mounds is that, now I will tell you, archaeologists no longer excavate burials. We have not done that for a very long time without permission, without permits. And we look back to the work that was previously done where there was none of that. There was no permission, no permits or anything, and it was very common for archaeologists to just sort of launch right in. But what we do know from those excavations is something that has opened our eyes to just how complex these cultures were and how far-reaching their connections were. The burial mound offerings came as far away as the western Great Lakes with copper and galena, all the way down to the Gulf Coast with shells, out to the Atlantic with whelk shells that were made into masks. It's amazing. And that whelk shell trade went from the Chesapeake all the way up to the Great Lakes. And the copper came back. And we think that the people here in the interior were probably the middlemen. We think that they were probably the ones who were connecting up those areas. And remember, when we're talking about the coastal plain during this late period, we're talking about the rise of the Powhatan chiefdom. We're talking about the rise of Sinocomico, basically the region of Powhatan. So very important to keep that in mind. It's also the case that folks began living together in what we call nucleated villages. So instead of being spread out in houses along the rivers, they started living together, in some instances inside of palisades. This is a really cool photograph. This is what you're seeing here is early spring, and you're looking at the outlines. These are not mushroom circles. You're looking at the outlines of these houses. The grass will pick up the moisture from the really rich soil where the poles from the houses have rotted in place hundreds of years ago. And when you get into the early spring and things start greening up, you will see these circles that are marking those houses. So again, right here in front of us. There is a particular type of ceramic from this time period called Page, named for the Page Valley, where it was first documented, and you can see that it is found all through this area. So strong connections. People who were living in the mountains, in the valley, were very strongly connected together. But there's also something really interesting that happens toward the end of the woodland period, and that is a whole new group of people showed up in this region. We're still trying to figure out what happened because the ancestors of the Monacan were here, they stayed in place, and yet there are these other folks who are coming in and out, using that valley, doing what the valley does, funneling people. And so around 1,000 years ago, the great Mississippian culture that is known from the heartland, St. Louis, where there is the Monk's Mound. Some of you may have been there, you see the photograph there, but this is a really complex phenomenon that had different regional expressions, but there was one in the Ohio Valley. Around 1,000 years ago, it appears that there was a diaspora. It appears that the Mississippian culture and all of its connections began to break. Lots of discussion as to what happened. Was it climate? Are we looking at warfare? What happened to make this occur? But what happens here is that the folks from Ohio appear to make their way down the Potomac and down into the Shenandoah Valley. And they're a different group of people. It may be that what we are looking at is the ancestral Eastern Siouan cultures that are really coming from the Ohio Valley and getting well established into this part of the eastern United States. But it's called the Kaiser culture, named for a site in the Page Valley that was first excavated back in the 1940s. But we call it the Kaiser culture, and this is what their towns look like. They were towns. They were not little villages. They were actually towns within palisades. And the palisades we don't think were defensive structures. We think that they were meant more to sort of keep animals out because these folks were growing corn, but also as a way of sort of saying, this is us, just as we use fences today. We think that may have been part of it as well. The Kaiser culture, from 600 to 350 years ago, so when the Europeans start showing up, the Kaiser culture is here along with the ancestral Monacan nation. There's no question about that, and this is showing you the North Fork and the South Fork of the Shenandoah coming together at Front Royal, and then coming on out through Clark County up toward Harper's Ferry, and you can see where those Kaiser villages are located, and it looks like they were originally from the Page culture, and they coalesced. People came together and formed these much larger villages of multicultural groups. It is really interesting to see what's going on. Not just one type of pottery, 3 or 4 different types of pottery. Very, very interesting to tell that story. Big storage pits, but again, you're looking at post molds and the house pattern, and when we talk about the house patterns, I've mentioned that several times, this is what we've got. The cut white pieces of paper are marking those stains. This is the floor plan, and when rebuilt, this is an ati, or a roundhouse. And this is a lot of what we find in the archaeological record when we're doing this kind of work. Another thing that is very interesting because it deals with freshwater mussels is there was a shell bead trade coming out of this part of eastern North America and going out to the coast. We have found ribbed mussel shells that beads that come from the coast, and freshwater mussel shells they have been found here, and then freshwater mussel shells that have been found down at the coast. And there's a trade in these objects as well. We think there was a deer hide trade. There is a lot of evidence to indicate that the people living in the interior here now we have to keep in mind we're talking about a climate change again, the Little Ice Age. So a cooling. This part of Virginia had lots of grass. The valley was a cold grass environment, again, not as cold as the Pleistocene, but very much a kind of environment that would have been conducive to lots of deer, whereas out on the coast, very dry, not a place, and yet these folks on the coast needed their deer hides. And so we think there may have been a deer hide trade that started long before the Europeans arrived in this area. There's a very strong connection in these river systems. The Potomac people, who today are focused more down in Stafford County, their culture expanded all the way up the Potomac River Valley and down into the Shenandoah Basin itself. And at these Kaiser farm sites, we not only find evidence of their palisades, the fences around, and all the houses that are inside, we find tobacco pipes that are decorated in the same way as the pottery, and then some. We find shell masquettes that are coming from the coastal plain, and these things are all showing up in the interior. It's really pretty fascinating to think about it. So when you compare those two types of ceramics, the Kaiser Farm ceramics and the Potomac Creek ceramics, you can see the overlay. But they're very different cultures. The Potomac Creek people were Algonquin speakers. They were Algonquin speakers, coastal migration, whereas the folks from in the interior, the Kaiser people, were Eastern Siouan. So there's a coalescence of culture, and there is no evidence of violence. Absolutely no evidence of violence. And I cannot emphasize that enough. At the time of European settlement, European colonization, this is what the map looked like. This is how complicated it was. The Europeans had no idea what they were walking into. They had no idea what they were walking into. These are the names that you might recognize. Some of them are the archaeological names, but it gives you a sense of the complexity of this landscape. And so Western Virginia at the time of European settlement and coming over into this part as well would have been occupied by Monacan and Manahoac. Manahoac, another Siouan tribe. Its citizens, its members have probably been subsumed, but you can you get the idea of what we're talking about here. Based on John Smith's map, it looks like the Blue Ridge was a major boundary. It looks like you've got Siouan-speaking people living at the base of the Blue Ridge and coming to the west, and your Algonquin cultures more to the east. So this is a place that had seen, once again, at the time of European settlement, had begun to see incredible mixing and exchange as well as interaction between these different native groups. One of the more apocryphal stories in 1608, John Smith is making his way up the Rappahannock River, and at the falls he encountered a man named Amarolac. There was an attack by the Manahoac, and they captured Amarolac, and they asked him if he knew who they were. And Amarolek said, "We heard you were a people come from under the world to take our world away from us." But they also asked him what he knew beyond the mountains, and he said, the sun. What do you know what's beyond the mountains? And he said, the sun. Now, was he protecting people? We don't know, but he did not divulge information to them about who was actually living here in the valley and in the Panhandle. But it is interesting because he says, we know nothing else because the woods were not burnt. And remember, that was one of their hunting traditions, was to burn the woods and drive the animals. And so that's part of this story as well. One site that is very, very interesting is not that far from here, the Barton site, which is on the north branch of the Potomac in Allegheny County, Maryland. You can see it with the star, and it's on the floodplain. You can see the north branch there, but within this one floodplain, which is large, there are Page sites, culture sites, there are Kaiser sites, and there are also Susquehannock sites. More on that here in just a second. 1640, the Susquehannocks are in the Potomac River Valley. They're shifting out of Pennsylvania. They're probably being pushed by the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, who have started to come down into Pennsylvania, and they start coming out in this direction, and there are several very large Susquehannock villages that have been excavated. This one is in Upper Tract, and they have a large number of European trade goods on them. You can look at the date and imagine this is still pretty early in terms of European settlement. And then the big one at Moorfield. Again, we're looking at the South Branch in this instance, but it is interesting that there was this response on the part of the Susquehannock who were threatened, and they said, we're splitting, we're going west. And they ended up there and set up shop, so to speak. We also need to keep in mind that this is a landscape that was very fraught in terms of Native people interacting themselves, trying to figure out territory, and once the European pressure was put on for trading in animal hides, particularly in beaver, things got pretty hot. And so the Haudenosaunee started to engage in what are known by historians as the Iroquois or the Beaver Wars, intermittent warfare. The Five Nations who were involved in this, they had become very dependent economically on the European fur trade. They overhunted their own areas and ultimately ended up coming to the south. They had alliances, so the British and the Dutch aligned with the Iroquois, the French aligned with the Huron and the Algonquins, and by the mid-17th century, the beaver populations were pretty much gone in the Great Lakes region, and folks began to move. The Haudenosaunee began moving in this area, and the Dutch gave them guns. And once that happened, everything started to shift very, very quickly. There was constant warfare, and the European governments recognized this. They saw the friction, and they began to get involved and push. And you start to see where this is going. You start to see things coming apart at that point in time. Susquehannock tried to resist. They signed treaties, but ultimately the Haudenosaunee absorbed them, and they moved west out to the Ohio Valley. And so that story happened, that played out just in 2 or 3 generations. People who had been in place for thousands of years, all of a sudden finding themselves unmoored. It's a very difficult time. The Haudenosaunee claimed to the British, they told the British, we've taken care of the West for you. We've taken care of Western Virginia and Maryland and what is now West Virginia, and we can now talk about who controls that land. But at the same time, the historic record is saying not so fast. The historic record is saying there are still Native people here. This is John Lederer's map from 1670. I have circled all of the places that he has identified as native, having native villages on the east side of the Blue Ridge and over into the Shenandoah Valley. Indeed, there is also a strong history of native trails all through this area, not only the Great Path, the Great Road, the Warrior Path, Route 11, and so forth, but also looking at Route 50. You can see the ancestral Route 50 there. You can start to see some of the roads that we use today that had their starts as Native American trails. I think that's really important. Virginia in 1677, the colony, which of course at that time claimed all the land out to the Mississippi, essentially, signed what they called the Articles of Peace with the Virginia tribes, the ones that were close enough. And there are a number from Western Virginia who signed that treaty. in 1677. So they were still here. They hadn't gone. Their numbers had been diminished, but they were still here. And to show you how important this treaty was, when Queen Elizabeth came to Virginia in 2007 for the 400th commemoration of the settlement of Jamestown, she met with the chiefs. She met with the chiefs because the British government has a treaty relationship with those tribes. And it just goes to show you the way in which the colonial period was playing out in such a way that it was global. This became a globalized environment within a generation. So very big changes. The Piscataway established a village in the Potomac Piedmont Valley, trying to get away from the Susquehannocks. You see this conflict beginning at this point in time. You start to see folks who are trying hard to hold on to their trading networks with the Europeans and making their way around. 1699, two of the sheriffs from the Virginia colony went to the Piscataway Indians, and on the Heaters Island in the Potomac River, they found a fort, they found 9 cabins, and they found 215 people living there. And there have been excavations done, and there have been found a lot of Jesuit religious artifacts along with Native American artifacts. The Piscataway language was actually recorded by the Jesuits and is in the dictionary, is in the library at the Vatican, in the Potomac Valley. Very, very important for us to keep in mind. The Shawnee were in the lower valley in the late 17th century. You can see this is George Washington's map that he made for Lord Fairfax, and you can see he's got Shawano Indian fields, and he notes that they were deserted. And this would have been 1747, but it's very clear for them to have been deserted at that time. People had been there a generation before. So a dynamic region. So I don't need to really go through all of this with you, but just keep in mind that what happens is that the tribes themselves became polarized. They became pitted against each other, trying to figure out who they were going to ally with in terms of all of these European immigrants who were coming into the area. And there was a lot of instability. You're seeing diplomatic missions, there are hunting expeditions, trading, but all of this sort of explains what happened in terms of European occupation. So when we look at the valley, there is a pretty good story to tell. In 1707, Louis Michel's map of the Shenandoah Valley itself, and the Potomac Valley, it's a beautiful map. As you start looking along the Shenandoah Basin, what you start to recognize in using this map is that you can identify some of the features on it. And so we have Massanutten there, and Massanutten Mountain, and there is, we believe, Cedar Creek, and lo and behold, Cedar Creek, there is a settlement. And it does indeed correspond to an archaeological site that we know of that has been radiocarbon dated to 1694. So people were there. People were there. We want that story to be told. The Tuscarora migrated through, came right up the Great Valley, came through Martinsburg. There are stories of the Tuscarora setting up camp in Martinsburg and making their, Martinsburg, West Virginia. Martinsburg, Virginia. No, yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I forget where I am sometimes. But anyway, the Tuscarora coming up through this valley and making their way forward. This really tells you one of the stories, because the Tuscarora gathered up a lot of people who were still here and took them with them. They adopted them and took them with them. One of the descendants is Nicona, who is known as the last Tutelo, one of the Siouan-speaking peoples. And in 1870, he was interviewed by a linguist, and what he remembered of the Tutelo language was written down. And that is, he lived on the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario. And there may well be descendants from the Eastern Siouan people who are living on that reserve today. So a very complicated story. So finally, to end this, we have to ask the question, well, ultimately what happens? Why are there no communities today that we can recognize as Native American communities in this part of the valley? There are Native American people, but where are the Manahoac? Where's the Kaiser culture? What happened to them? And so treaties. You have to look at the historic treaties to understand that essentially the land was ceded, perhaps not with folks at the table, but with people who were supposedly representing them and all of a sudden, Western Virginia, West Virginia is off limits. And you begin to see that leading toward the French and Indian War, and at that point, everything gets kind of subsumed. You start to see historic records referring to just the Saponi people as though this is one language or one group of people, when really there's probably still a bunch of different folks living here. So history kind of fails us at this point. I do think it's very important, though. I want to just tell you that as we get to this backcountry narrative, the idea that this was a frontier, it was no frontier. It hadn't been a frontier for 13,000 years. And so when we call it a frontier, kind of doing a disservice to those people who had occupied this place for so long. I'm going to leave this slide with you so that you can think about it, but I also want to tell you that I'm going to jump forward here to my very last slide because I realize we're going a bit over here. I want you to know that we are seeing an incredible cultural resurgence today. And whenever I tell this story, my friends in the Native community always say, don't end with the bad stuff, because they're coming back. In Virginia, we have 7 federally recognized tribes, but they were not federally recognized, the first one until 2016. 5 in 2018. Currently, the Mattaponi have put their petition forward. And so we have 11 tribes total. 4 are state recognized. All were state recognized, and then 7 went forward for federal recognition, but it took this long. It took this long, but what has happened is they are coming around, and what you're finding is families are coming back together, people are moving back. There are museums now, there are powwows, and they want us to come. They want us to meet them. They want us to hear their stories. They want to find out more about us. And also, they want us to hear what happened to them and where they are now and where they want to go. So the universities in Virginia are working with the tribes, but more importantly, they're working with each other, and there is some really cool stuff going on. So I would hope that as you think about who these folks are, I introduced the chiefs to you early on, and there are our 7 federally acknowledged tribal governments. We talk about reclaim, repair, and move forward, and there are many organizations now that are working on this, but so many of them have said, do people know who we are? Do they know that we're still here? Do they know our story? And so when I have the chance to tell the story, I get pretty excited. Just keep in mind, it's not just in Virginia. The Piscataway, both the Piscataway Nation as well as the Piscataway Conoy have all kinds of events that are open to the public. Good to know them along the Potomac. The Potomac tribe itself has been reclaiming land. They have a beautiful museum in Stafford County in White Oak. That is open on a regular basis. And we also have organizations like mine, Mountain Valley, where we bring together people who want to learn more about this. So things are looking much better than they were even as recently as 10 years ago, and we're excited about where that's going to take us. And I thank you very much.
Okay. You're listening to the Future of Conservation podcast, where we feature thought leaders on the front lines of protecting wild places and wild things, and we share stories that inspire us to look at nature in a new way. Joining me today in the studio is Dr. Carole Nash, anthropologist and professor at James Madison University, where she has spent 37 years teaching. She was previously the consulting archaeologist for Shenandoah National Park for 20 years, and she has a nonprofit, Mountain Valley Archaeology, that she's created to educate and provide access to archaeological sites. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about it here in a minute. So we're here to explore the deep and rich history of the indigenous peoples of the Shenandoah and Potomac watersheds today, and it's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be with you.
So my first question is, what led you to archaeology and anthropology?
So I always begin by
reminding folks that I myself am not indigenous. And that's an important thing to do because we respect the stories, the work that we're doing, the potential stories that we might uncover, but also the partnerships that we develop with indigenous communities and other descendant communities as well. And what led me to archaeology was really a love of that history and wanting to know more about it and recognizing that I knew so little. And that I grew up in a very rural part of Virginia where we would find spear points, we would find things in the garden, and the question would always be who left them there. And so as a child, I was always very, very curious about this. But I had never considered the possibility of being an archaeologist until I went to college and found out that you could actually have a career in it, and that it was very fulfilling in that it's very a multidisciplinary field. And so when you do archaeology, you get to think about geology, you get to think about geography, you bring in a lot of different skills. And so you have the opportunity to really investigate many different areas and figure out what it is you like to do. And for me, I like being outside, I like surveying the landscape, I like doing historical research, but what really means a great deal is finding partners to work with and to know that the work that I'm doing is going to make a difference for people.
What a wonderful overview. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose Appalachia?
So I just have always been drawn to mountains. I grew up in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains in central Virginia, and realized that in many places, mountains have been overlooked. In Virginia, for example, we have an incredible archaeological tradition, and for so long it focused on the coast, it focused on historical sites that are well known, and that's wonderful work, but people were just not looking at the mountains. And when you are from the mountains and you know how rich the stories are and you know how important mountains are to people, you start to think about the possibilities of there being old stories and deep stories that tie together human culture and environment. And I think that when you are in the mountains, there is just something so immediate about having that experience and just realizing that you're in a place where people have been for a very long time, but their stories are often very hidden.
So regarding hidden stories, could you introduce us to the primary peoples who lived in our watersheds?
That is a question that we get asked as archaeologists a lot. We find, for example, that archaeological sites in this part of Virginia and West Virginia, in particular along the Shenandoah and the Potomac, are at least 12,000 years old and potentially even older. So we are talking about first peoples who came at the end of the Ice Age into a very different environment than we are used to seeing today. And those cultures that were in place here for that long, as I always tell my students, we are talking about 500 generations of people. Those of us who came as Europeans and settled in Virginia, for example, going back, even if we go back to the earliest times of English settlement, 1607, for example, you're only looking at about 15 generations. And so when you think about people who are here for 500 generations, the way that their cultures developed and the way that they understand natural resources and the environment is something that is very difficult for us to even begin to approximate. And so the traditional ecological knowledge that is embedded in these cultures and that has been carried forward is just a phenomenally rich library. And so when we think about 15,000 years ago, we're talking about small groups of hunter-gatherers, family groups that came into this area and were moving through the river systems and going up into the mountains and then back in the river valleys. And it's really not until you move forward in time by almost 10,000 years that you we find evidence of settled villages and town life. And those are the folks who are ancestral to the tribes that are in the region today. So the Potomac people along the Potomac River, the Piscataway along the Potomac River, the Monacan Nation, and the Eastern Siouan-speaking people along the Shenandoah.
Wow, that is really wide time perspective, 500 generations. Thank you for that. Could you tell us a little bit about the deep ecological knowledge held by these American indigenous people who lived here, especially in terms of the foraging and the seasonal cycles and medicinal plants? And I would love
to. What a great question. And also this is where archaeology kind of gets limited, because we live in an area that, even though we're in drought now, is overwhelmingly moist. And our soils are acidic, and so they don't lend themselves well to preservation. So we estimate that when we're doing archaeology, we're finding just a very small piece of all of the material culture that Native people would have left behind. And so we're trying to put a story together just by having a tiny little window into what their lives were like. But we know from what we have found, and we know from where sites are settled, where we find archaeological sites located on the landscape, it's very clear, very purposeful, very much in places where there would have been very rich resources in terms of mast, nuts, berries, of course, but also fish, mammals, just about everything that you can think of. A very broad-based diet that goes well beyond what we are used to thinking about today as edible resources. And so, for example, if you are fortunate when you're excavating and you are working in an environment where there has been fire, say you're excavating a fire hearth, sometimes there will be seeds that are preserved because they've been charred. And we will find seeds from Chenopodium, lamb's quarters. That's not unusual at all. Or you might find sunflower, or you might find gourd. You will definitely find evidence of plants that were used by Native people and that were specifically chosen. There's also some pretty interesting evidence when you look at where plants are distributed today, and the possibility that some of the plants that we have in certain places, so for example, chinkapins would be one example. They are where they are today because they were intentionally planted by Native people, and that's an area of study that we're only beginning to think about, we're only beginning to ask. I think that as we become greater partners with indigenous communities and we respect the knowledge that they have, we recognize that there are lots of stories that were passed down and protected about this kind of thing. So lots of information about when to hunt, where to hunt, the resources that would be available at a given time of year.
So when you talk about preserved history and stories, we often talk about indigenous people in past tense, but these are living cultures and with contemporary relevance. And you mentioned some plants that were used then that we still use today. How can we better understand the continuity of indigenous perspectives, especially in terms of relationship to land and natural resources?
Ask them. Ask them. That's the best thing you can do. As an archaeologist, I bring a certain kind of evidence. I bring multiple lines of evidence that come from the scientific perspective. And what we're finding is that that's very important. That takes you down routes that will get you much farther than you thought you could ever go. So we've been able to, for example, using GIS, we've been able to put together very, very broad landscape scale understandings of how Native people moved through the landscape. But when it comes to understanding daily life and understanding what places meant to them in the past and what they mean today, it's very, very important to talk to them and find out from them what's important. And they will tell you. You can build partnerships and they will tell you, but I'll give you an example. Dr. Brad Hatch, who is an archaeologist and also a citizen of the Potomac tribe, is one of the few people left who knew how to make eel pots. And eel pots are beautifully woven baskets that are set in basically shallow waters, but when the eels will migrate, they will be caught in the pots, and then they were processed. The meat was sold, but they were also used for fishing bait and things of that sort. But very, very important seasonal activity. And so he has brought that back, but he brought it back because there were people in his family who knew how to do it and remembered. And I think that a lot of times, because in this part of North America, in this part of the United States, we have let Native history and Native people be invisible for so long, that we have forgotten that there is this incredible body of knowledge that they hold, and that they use that to protect land. They use that to manage resources. And as they are able to get more land back themselves, their management strategies are absolutely tied to the old ways of doing things.
That's a great segue to my next question for you, which is about efforts to return land to tribal stewardship, and to allow practices of spiritual practices to be practiced again on public lands. How does this shape the future of Native communities and ecological resilience?
I think there are a number of ways to answer that question. I think that for in the Middle Atlantic region, for the tribes who are getting land back and who are finding that places that were known to them ancestrally or that were passed down, information passed down about them through family lines, the way that reinforces their identity, the way that brings back to them this sense of what it means to be part of a tribal community, but also the responsibility that is passed, because what comes with that is very much the idea that there is a strong stewardship element. And so using the older methods of managing, for example, fishing, and thinking, how much do you take in any given catch? How do you preserve the fish stocks? And things of that sort. What you find is that their management strategies are the very strategies that we need today when we are looking at impacts on environment, impacts on fisheries, impacts on wildlife. Even something as basic as fire. Now, the tribes themselves in the Middle Atlantic are not engaging in prescribed burns per se, but when you look at what we find archaeologically is evidence of low ground fires, what we call our creeping ground fires, on a regular basis. And so that kept forests very healthy. And I would hope that at some point we can start to think about fire as a management tool that is not so scary, but one that really does have a great deal to do with how healthy our forests are. And that's indigenous knowledge.
Fire as a stewardship
Fire
practice.
as a stewardship practice.
Neat. So along those lines, what are some of the lessons that we can draw from worldviews, indigenous worldviews, in terms of our relationship with Earth, not as a resource, but as a relative or as a partner?
I learn more about this all the time. Last week I was at the Sovereign Nations of Virginia Conference, which is held every year. It's sponsored by the Rappahannock Indian Tribe. And this year's conference was about the rights of nature. And one of the points that was made is that when you look at resources, not as resources but as relatives, the way that you think about them and the way that you manage them is completely different. There was also a lot of discussion about this interesting idea, land that owns itself. And there is actually a legal movement now to work with localities. And there is one example from Colorado of a mountain that owns itself. But basically what that means is the environment itself has personhood. The environment has rights. And so when we talk about stewardship, it's one thing to say it's our responsibility to care for X. But on the other hand, if we recognize the inherent rights of that river or that mountain, the question becomes who gets to say how it is managed. And so the idea that, for example, the Rappahannock tribe has now put into their constitution the statement that the Rappahannock River is a living being. And they have given it rights. And this is the first Native American constitution in the United States that has done that. It's been done in other places, New Zealand, for example. But what that means is we think hard about how we withdraw water. We think hard about clean water. We think hard about how watersheds are connected. And we really do think of rivers as living beings as opposed to a water resource that should be managed.
Wow. You were talking about rivers and the Rappahannock tribe. Can you tell us a little bit more broadly about rivers as a source of mobility?
Sure. There's a very long history there. And when you think about how this part of North America was settled, and you think about how Native people were moving into this area, the rivers were critical. And there's no question that when we document the locations of Native American sites, we find more sites along rivers, obviously the need for water, but travel was very important. And so we find, for example, I mentioned that Native people have been here for at least 12,000 years, if not longer, in this region. If you actually follow that through, what we find is that historically, the rivers themselves become conduits for trade, they become conduits for group interaction, and ultimately they become important geographic boundaries where tribes are toward the settlement with agriculture, with an agricultural way of life, where tribes are really becoming more associated with specific river valleys. And so if you think about this from the concept of the watershed, we can think about this at different scales, and there's no question that large migrations occurred along big rivers, but when you start looking at the smaller rivers, you start to see the everyday stories, the seasonal stories as well.
That's fascinating. And how did you decide to study these particular watersheds, Potomac and Shenandoah?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with, of course, my love of mountains and the fact that these are two of our major drainages. I also have not moved very far in my geographically from where I grew up, and I've just always been absolutely fascinated with the Blue Ridge. But I also think that when we're thinking about the Potomac and the Shenandoah as a system, and we think about the fact that this system is connected to the Chesapeake Bay, and I've done work all through the Middle Atlantic in all regions, out on the coast as well, but there is a connection that exists with these rivers that ties together the story of the land.
Here at NCTC, we have a fish weir in our river. We've got about, I think, a quarter of a mile frontage of the Potomac. Could you tell us what that fish weir might mean? You can see the rocks as they come together.
So what a great question. And you know, there is actually a citizen science program where folks are using Google Earth to try to identify fish weirs in rivers all over the United States. And what we are finding is that throughout the Shenandoah and the Potomac, fish weirs were built by Native people, but they continued to be used well into the historic period. And so there are lots of ways to, I guess you could say, create an intervention so that you can control the movement of fish so that you can catch them. And fish weirs are one, just very simple stacks of rock that form a V in the river, and one is surprised that they survive floods, particularly given the major floods that we have seen in this river system, but they are very old. And one of the things that we find is that with every fish weir, on the banks, on the floodplains, there will be pretty significant Native American occupations. And this goes back for thousands of years. One of the challenges in trying to understand the long-term changes that have occurred in the environment as well as in cultural response has to do with the fact that so much of our archaeological research has focused on floodplains, and floodplains are very dynamic environments. And so sometimes the floods will scour sites and take them away. Sometimes they will bury them under feet of silt, and it'll be difficult to get to them. But if you can actually get to the archaeological sites going back in time, stratified layer after layer after layer in these places that people kept coming back to, we find that you begin to see intensive settlement along the rivers, and this is probably when fish weirs were starting to be built around 4,000 years ago. And this was a time period when the rivers had started to warm, There were significant fish runs that had started at this point, and you can just imagine hundreds of people, families on these floodplains, fishing and taking their baskets out into the river where the weir was controlling the movement of the fish and just gathering them up. You know, we talk about shooting fish in a barrel. This is kind of the same basic idea, but we also find in association with those weirs fire hearths, very large fire hearths, where more than likely the harvest of fish, and you think of it as a harvest, would have been processed, they would have been smoked and preserved.
We have what some think might be some burial sites along the river. Is that likely to be? We see mounds of rocks not far from the weir.
Well, it would be unlikely in terms of location. There is no question that there are burial mounds in this part of the Middle Atlantic, in the western Middle Atlantic. Actually, two different burial mound traditions. But the burial mound tradition that is associated with the weirs, more often than not, this is the Middle Woodland stone mound tradition, and they are up on the bluffs above the rivers. The larger, what we call accretional mounds, which came several hundred years later, are in floodplains, but they are usually where small streams and very big rivers come together, not where you find the weirs.
That's fascinating. And why would the confluence of a small and a large be chosen as a burial site?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm going to you'll hear a little bit about that in my talk this evening. But I do think that when you think about locations, the burial mounds that were on the bluffs above the weirs, that were above the villages where the weirs were built, it's almost as though these are ancestral burials. These are people who were seen as ancestors and are overlooking. These are burial mounds that have very few people in them, whereas the accretional mounds, which were several hundred years later, contain hundreds of individuals, and they are located in central locations, and there were multiple villages that brought their dead to these mounds to be buried together. And so they're communal burial places. And so if you think about confluence, the idea of confluence and what that means, very much these were confluences of communities in life and in death.
If you could change anything about the way currently science and indigenous knowledge interact on the landscape or in terms of the way we manage our laws or our rules, what would you change?
Oh my goodness, that is a great question, because our discipline is in upheaval now. Our discipline is undergoing a great change, and it's good and needed change. And so my first answer to your question is, we have indigenous partners who are at the table at the beginning. We build the table together. We don't just create a space for them, but we build the table together. I think that for so long, archaeology is something that has been done to people. It's not been something that has been done with people, and we've taken a lot for granted. And so in bringing in indigenous partners, what we find is that archaeology is able to provide information that they need, but also it is much more enriched as a practice if they are there from the beginning and they can talk to us about why things are important, who should have access, not just assuming everyone has access, but who should have access to these artifacts and to these archaeological sites, who should be caring for them, how should they be treated. That's a completely different way of doing archaeology, and it's a more sustainable way of doing archaeology.
Fascinating. And similarly, in your work, what has most surprised you, or what's been something that's really shifted your perspective and your worldview on land and its long history, the way people relate to the environment?
I've been really fortunate in my career that in working in the mountains and knowing them as well as I do, that I've had some latitude in terms of the questions that I'm asking. So, for example, I'm very interested in waterfalls as sacred spaces. And we've been doing something at JMU called acoustic archaeology, where we're listening to the land. And very, very simply, came across it in Shenandoah National Park, walking across a site that we knew had been there, and we'd walked across it many, many times, but it never made sense because it's not where one would expect to find a site. It's not where the ground is flat. It's not south facing where you get morning sun, not close to water, and yet there were very interesting artifacts that were showing up. There was pottery there, which you typically don't find in the mountains. Beautifully made blades that were from raw materials from far away. And it's almost as though they had been left there on purpose, but we could never figure out why. We kept saying, oh, this is a one-off. This just, our model tells us there shouldn't be a site here. And so one day I was standing at this site, and for whatever reason, I was listening and I heard the waterfall. And you couldn't see it. You couldn't see the waterfall, but you could hear it. And so I was thinking, well, that's odd. And so started thinking about some of the other places where we had been, and we were finding pottery in association with waterfalls, and recognizing that, once again, very odd locations that didn't make sense from a scientific perspective as the way he had laid it out, but yet there they were. And so we started to wonder, is it possible that the sound of the waterfall is enough to indicate that you are walking into a sacred space and there is a need to leave an offering? And getting into the historical literature and the ethnographic literature that other anthropologists have left from interviewing indigenous people, what we found is that all across eastern North America, tribes have very clear ideas about waterfalls as dangerous places, as sacred and dangerous places. We know they can be very dangerous. They are slippery. We know that people will die at waterfalls if they're not careful. But the belief that there were little people who live at waterfalls who, if you don't acknowledge them, can really create trouble for you. And that tradition has been passed through Cherokee, it's been passed through Muskogee, it has been passed through Anishinaabe, it has been passed through Haudenosaunee, but beliefs that there are beings that live at these waterfalls, and that if you are not careful and acknowledge them, you could get into trouble. And so we've now found this in 6 different locations in the Blue Ridge, and we are wondering if we might be seeing something here, or might be hearing something that archaeologically we could not access because our models were in the way.
That is fascinating and very exciting. To close us out, what is one thing you would like our listeners to take away? If nothing else, what would you like people to remember?
That indigenous people are not just people of the past. Archaeology is fascinating. There is nothing like archaeology. It is the coolest thing to be excavating and to hold something in your hand that no one has seen for thousands of years. There is nothing like it. But at the same time, if we stop there, we're doing a tremendous harm to the communities today. And so I think the most important thing is recognizing that our work is part of a trajectory, that it's not a stopping point, but rather it opens doors, and that the really important question is, where do we take it? Where does it go from here?
Carole, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure having you with us.
I've enjoyed it very much.
We look forward to seeing your presentation, which will be posted along with this video and podcast. Okay. So we look forward to staying in touch with you in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for your questions.